Once it was decided internally to shut down Recap, Brian and his team spent a lot of time reflecting. The company was down, but definitely not out. Sure, there were some mistakes or missteps with Recap, as well as circumstances beyond their control. There also were some positives. Recap helped popularize the use of video with students. Thousands of videos were recorded on Recap, allowing students to talk more and to develop their voice. And it's that idea of student voice that would become central to their next venture. On October 8th, 2018, the same update that he announced the closing of Recap, Brian introduced Swivl's newest platform. Here's Brian announcing Synth in a 2018 promotional video.
Synth, interactive podcasts in bite-sized increments.
Use the orange plus button to capture audio or video synths quickly and easily. From there, you can share and embed synths externally anywhere.
Rather than focusing primarily on student video in the way that Recap did, the concept behind Synth is all about audio, allowing a student or any user to customize their audio experience by recording, listening, and even collecting podcasts in shorter segments known as synths. The concept behind Synth has two main components. First, the idea of inverting the production process through micro-podcasting, basically allowing anyone, even those with no prior training, to record a podcast in seconds.
A student can come in and essentially use Synth as an exit ticket as a first experience and have to do no editing, no other treatment to it other than pressing a button and hitting publish. So it's very, very simple flow with a few buttons. But even within the same tool set, you can start layering on sound effects or doing multiple synths in a row. And then once you combine those two things together, it starts to sound like you're creating a more traditional podcast. And our goal with the tool sets is we really start to blur the boundary there where you can do some minor editing and sound effects, and it actually could end up sounding exactly like a traditional podcast when you're done with that. But you've done it in this inverted way versus capturing a long file and going through a traditional production experience. You kind of built it up in layers versus starting with something almost analog and breaking it down into what you need.
Users can also upload a longer podcast, which Synth will automatically break down into shorter segments. The initial idea for recording in Synth was actually developed from a little-known feature in Recap, the audio-only response.
What we saw very, very consistently from an early time was camera shyness being a problem for students acting natural and getting the value from sharing their voice. What I always felt like was that the camera confuses the purpose of what you're doing a little bit because it brings in different emotions than the ones you're trying to foster, which is how to communicate effectively, explain your ideas, things like that. And we actually, even within Recap, did some experiments with audio-only responses as a feature when we saw so many people struggling with this. And you see other people struggling with this in the use of Flipgrid. They'll talk about putting sticky notes and things over cameras. That kind of kicked off the process of, well, what does audio only mean? And that, podcasting is a natural fit when you're talking about an audio only kind of communication.
This is where you see the influence of Recap in Synth. The core of student voice is still there, but rather than only creating video responses, they could now record short audio responses, or synths. Teachers or students can listen to these synths individually or consecutively, like a traditional podcast or audio show.
And we started to mix that insight up with traditional podcasting and looking at ways that we could bring something innovative that blurs the boundaries a little bit between what a traditional podcast is and really what Recap and Flipgrid represent, which is more clip-based development of communication.
The second part of Synth is currently under development and hasn't been released to the public yet. This version is known as Synth 2.0. It's more about finding and discovering content by other podcasters and isolating certain segments.
So say you're a history teacher and you want to use popular podcast content as an instructional element for your students. Today, that's a very difficult thing to do. How do you use Dan Carlin's Hardcore History as a piece of instruction with your 30 students? It's 4 hours long, right? If we can build an experience with a couple different pillars on it, one is we've translated his work into bites. You as a teacher can grab the 3 or 4 most salient sound bites, arrange them in a private podcast, and then host a classroom discussion around the key points that are shared within that podcast. You really created something that I think takes popular, relevant, engaging content, but brings it into the classroom and helps you really use it in an authentic way. And I think once we get to that point in time, which is really only a couple of months away for us to have all these pieces in place, we've created a connection between the outside world and the education world that I think is a really valuable bond for educators to use in lots of different ways.
What Brian says here is interesting to me because as teachers look to use podcasts in their classroom, it's not always very easy. Let's say you want to share this podcast, EdTech Stories Episode 2, with your students, but you only want to hear 2 or 3 comments from Brian and not the awesome narration that I worked so hard on. It's okay, I understand. But how would you do that? Do you insert the link to Spotify with timestamps for students to skim through? Do you download the audio file, edit your clips with another program, and then upload and share your edited audio file? Neither of these options really sound ideal. But the new version of Synth 2.0 should allow educators to curate segments from a number of different podcasts, isolate the audio that they want, build a collection, and then share that collection with students easily through one link. It would be almost like creating your own podcast mixtape for students. Jeff Bradbury is an educator from New Jersey. He's also the founder of the TeacherCast Network, which offers 9 different educational podcasts. So he knows a thing or two about podcasting.
I remember seeing news about Synth on Twitter, and I was really excited because I'm always looking for different ways that we can bring podcasting or really any audio and video platform into the educational realm, into the classroom.
Jeff is high on the ability for anyone to create a podcast through Synth.
Traditionally, when we look at podcasts, we often start with the questions of how to, what to, and we look at things like equipment and platform. With Synth, we don't have to worry about any of those things. In fact, many times when teachers are using the word podcast, they simply are looking for a way to bring audio and video into their classrooms. They want it simple, they want it quick, and most importantly, they want it for free. All 3 of those things is where Synth excels.
Jeff reviews a lot of EdTech products for his podcast and website, and he's named Synth the best in class on teachercast.com.
Well, I truly think that Synth is the best audio and video platform out there for teachers. It does so many things right, and it's constantly evolving. First, it gives teachers a free platform for which their students can create small, bite-sized pieces of content, and also a platform from which they can develop and grow a content stream.
This past September, Brian made the announcement that he was moving forward with the launch of Synth 2.0, featuring the ability to search and curate segments from popular podcasts. But rather than releasing it publicly, as he did with the first version of Synth, he announced that it will be shared through a private beta, meaning that it will only be tested by a small group of users, not a public audience. In a blog post, Brian called Synth 2.0 the Pinterest of podcasts, and the tagline was, "Listen with purpose." So it's clear that this new release will focus heavily on content discovery, allowing users to customize and share their listening experience. And this brings us back to the comeback. After closing down Recap 2 years ago, can Swivl complete this comeback with podcasting? It might be some time before we know a definite answer, and Brian explains why.
Even when I'm positive and the response has been positive, it does take a long time to build real traction around things. I've seen lots of people talking about this in other sectors as well as in education. Usually it takes 3 to 4 years for something that is well executed and gets well managed through the early phases to really catch on at scale, right? And it's just because it takes time to pervade people's consciousness for them to understand how it can have value to their lives, even when they see initial promise in it.
The current version of Synth right now isn't generating any revenue, and Swivl as a company will continue to feed fund the venture moving forward. Still, Brian feels pretty good about the initial reception for Synth 1.0 and the plans he has in store for Synth 2.0.
I'd say I'm very positive. I would say it's even slightly better than our experience in first launching Recap. When we first started Recap, of course, the whole idea of what we were doing was foreign. Pretty much nobody had an idea of using video for exit tickets at the time because there was nothing there for it. And so we had to build the enthusiasm and the awareness of what it could do kind of more organically. And in this case, there's now already a developed sense of what voice means and can do in a classroom. And so as we launch these tools, there's much more immediate resonance.